Greetings all. Welcome back to the Coptimizer podcast. Got another awesome guest today, Suzanna Hasnay, retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent. And we're going to talk about mindfulness today. And Suzanna and I was fortunate to meet her out in Las Vegas at the TaserCon conference where she was presenting on mindfulness. And welcome to the show, Suzanna.
Thanks, Patrick. Thanks for inviting me. It's great to be here. I'm glad this worked out.
So I think by the time this episode airs, people may have heard the short that we did on site in Las Vegas at the MGM, which was pretty cool. It was a high energy environment. It was neat to see all the different types of I think some of these cutting edge modern training ideas and philosophies all in one place. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the future.
I agree. I think it was pretty incredible that you have this company, Taser, that decided to make their entire first conference, really, right, on all about officer health and wellness and well-being and performance. It's pretty amazing. So I was honored to be there.
Yeah. So I think this is going to be a fun conversation today because like one of the things that we touched on there and that what I want to touch on today is and speaking of Taser and speaking of equipment, you can have all the best technology, you can have all of the best training, you can have all of the best equipment. But if this space in between the ears is not in a good place, or if it is not optimized, then we are spinning our wheels. And we could be potentially wasting a lot of time and effort. And so I'm really looking forward to digging into a little bit with you today about why this is so important. So the class that you taught there is called Mindfulness for Performance and Well-being. And since we're on the Coptimizer podcast, and optimization and peak performance is really what our discussions are evolving around. How about we just kind of jump in with your background and how how does a special agent from the FBI wind up teaching about mindfulness?
Well, that's a long story, which I'm happy to talk about because I frankly did not even remotely think I'd be doing this in my retirement time after the Bureau. I was an agent for a little over 20 years. And in 1997, when I first got in the FBI, I was at the academy. I mean, not in a million years would I have thought that I would be a mindfulness and yoga coach for our hostage rescue team, and to be able to take this training out on the road with some of our FBI SWAT teams, a lot of our FBI SWAT teams, and also with the state and local law enforcement as well as leadership teams, evidence response teams. Not ever did that ever cross my mind. But when I look back at it, I had my background about 100 years before I was an agent. I was a professionally trained dancer, and my ballet was my base. And I did a little bit of professional dance here and there. I was never, frankly, I was never good enough to be like a full-time member of the New York City Ballet, not even close or anything like that. But I held my own, did what I could do. And then I ended up.
So you were going to get hired as like you were going to be like one of these special agents that like the Black Swan, where they recruit you in and you use your dance skills to do all of the secret squirrel agent stuff, right? Like you could have been like no, not like a secret assassin like I read about in some of my novels.
No.
That's badass, though.
Sorry to just kind of burst your bubble, but yeah, it wasn't all that glamorous. No, it really wasn't. But, I ended up going to get my undergraduate degree in dance from the University of Akron in Ohio, and every parent's dream, right? I was a dance major. Can't you just be an engineer or, like my brother, or be a lawyer? No, Mom, I want to go get a dance degree. And she's like, oh my gosh. My parents, mostly my mom, literally said to me when I was, 18-ish, she said, go ahead and get your degree. We'll pay for it and be a dancer for as long as you want to be. She said, but please go get your master's in something practical. That's what she said to me, right? And just like every good parent, and at the time I was like, whatever. I just want to do my thing as a dancer, just like an athlete or whatever. You just want to do your thing, right? And then eventually, of course, mom was right, and I did, to be true to my word to her. That was my promise to her. I would do it. I went and got my master's degree in business, right? Why not? Business from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And ironically, there's a connection there between now the work I do now and my one of my colleagues, Chad McGehee, who I'll talk about in a little bit, who is the director of meditation for Wisconsin athletics. It's just a small world. You never know what's going to happen. So I ended up doing that in Wisconsin. And then from Wisconsin, I moved to Cleveland, and down the road, I became after I stopped dancing, et cetera, and a couple other jobs in between, I became back in the day, it was corporate wellness. I'm not even sure they even use that term anymore, but the director of wellness for BP America, the oil company. And they used to be headquartered out of Cleveland. Now they're in Chicago, but that was my job. I actually loved it. And the thing about it is, probably within the last few months, I reflected on that job. And I thought, oh my God, what I'm doing now started way back then when I was in my 20s. As the director of wellness programs there was no talk of mindfulness, even though obviously mindfulness had been around for thousands and thousands of years. That was not part of the Western conversation, at least not much, certainly not in Cleveland, in the early 90s. And so that wasn't even part of the vernacular then, but the whole idea of performance and well-being was already ingrained in me, starting at a young age of being a dancer and being very physical and going through the rejection and being knocked down and being hungry all the time, hungry for work, hungry physically for food, things like that. And it helped build my resilience at that young age. And I really didn't realize it. When I first got in the bureau, there's a whole other story there between director of corporate wellness, dancer, into the bureau. But eventually I made it into the bureau. But when I first got in the bureau, I remember being embarrassed telling people on the first day at the FBI Academy, when you stand up and you say, hey, I was a law enforcement officer, I was in the military, I was a teacher, and all these wonderful things. And here's Suzanna standing up. Well, I was a dancer, one of those. And I thought, oh my God, I was thinking, what am I doing here?
Well, I think maybe you're selling yourself a little short here, because anyone that's been to the ballet knows that it's not just dancing, right? That is about as pure of an athlete as you're ever going to see as someone on a ballet stage, and the amount of discipline and effort that takes to dance at that level is, it's really being a professional athlete. So
it
makes perfect sense.
Thanks, Patrick. And it's stayed with me. That discipline never leaves you. It never leaves you. And whether you're in sports or whatever particular skill set that you have that you really focus on and that you have a passion for, that stuff never leaves you, no matter what age. And I do believe I didn't appreciate it back then, what that particular area of training did for my life. And like you said, I've taken knocks, emotional, mental, and physical, and it really helped me a lot to get back up again. It really did. And that definitely came from my dance training and being in a world that's really difficult in all those areas of physicality and emotional and being told you're not good enough and all that stuff. So.
And, I think it's really interesting now to think about this in retrospect, but working as a wellness, in that wellness space back in the 90s for BP, it just goes to show you sometimes like how far behind the law enforcement sector is from the private sector in terms of performance optimization. Because when you look at these huge companies like BP, right, a global company, and they recognize that, listen, we have to invest in our employees if we're going to optimize, in them. It's for a company like that, it's right, you're optimizing profits for your shareholders and you're building a company. And I'm sure, and I know that's not the only motivation, but that's but at its base, that's what it is. And in policing, the word mindfulness, which we'll get to, or wellness, even in the early 2000s, when I started talking about some of this stuff back in my own agency, it was a foreign concept to a lot of people, and it was kind of like, that's all great and stuff, but let's make sure we focus on the real work, and everyone always kind of separate those things.
100%, 100%. I 100% agree, and you're right about that. And if I can be totally candid, we're still behind. We're still behind, and we're playing a lot of catch up, and it's unfortunate. But at least we're having a conversation. And look at what we just came back from TaserCon, and some of the wonderful work that they do in this arena, and with their coaching and all these concepts that they're bringing in. And I really appreciate that. But we need to keep this going. And I do believe, and maybe we'll get into this, but I do believe it's a leadership issue. It's a 100% leadership issue. And if you believe you need to, quote unquote, take care of your people, you need to take care of your people for real, and not just check the box and not give it lip service, and really have the courage to lean in a little bit and take a little bit of risk with maybe areas that are uncomfortable because you're not as knowledgeable about it. And mindfulness is one arena that has been a long time coming, and it's time. It's time.
So let's go back, because you said there's a funny story about how you wound up in the bureau. So let's hear that story.
When I was around 10 years old, I talked to my mom about being an FBI agent. Now, if you ask me, was that from watching something on TV? Maybe. I can tell you, I don't know why, but I wanted to be in the FBI. As from that early age, and my mom's like, "Oh, that's really nice, Susie. That's really cute." But just kind of went like this right over her head, and like, whatever, honey. And so, so fast forward to when I moved to Cleveland, I was working for BP. I couldn't dance anymore because I was done. Right, I was done dancing, and so I found my other love, which was running. And when I was a dancer, I wasn't, quote unquote, allowed to run because I was told it changes your musculature and all this kind of stuff that I don't believe in anymore. But that's what we were told back in those early days of dance training. And so I didn't run. I didn't play any other sport, even though I loved it. Like, I loved gym class when I was a kid and things like that. So I could finally, I'm going to run now, right? I'm going to start doing different, I'm going to get on my bike. I'm going to row. I'm going to do whatever I like to do. So I started running. So I joined a running club in Cleveland. And I also, within this club, I met a bunch of FBI agents, right? So it's just ironic that it was with a bunch of FBI agents. And then I raced. I did a 5-mile race. I remember distinctly, it was in Bay Village, Ohio, right outside of Cleveland. And I did this 5-mile race. There was a bunch of agents lived in Bay Village, and a bunch of us ran. And at the end of the race, a lot of times you go to somebody's house for a beer, lunch, or whatever. And so one of the agents had a little after party. So we went there, had a couple beers, everybody's sweaty and tired and things like that. And so one of the agents, he says, "Suzanna, did you ever think about being an FBI agent?" I went, "Oh my God." So I told him the story about being a little kid and wanting to do it. He said, "Well, why don't you do it? Why don't you do it?" And that's where it started. So it's so incredible how life works. That sometimes you're planning for things doesn't mean anything. Sometimes you need to plan. Sometimes you just got to let life play out. And even though that was always in the back of my mind, I had put it on the back burner, not because I hadn't thought about it, but because I was really happy with where I was. I was really satisfied with what I was doing. I loved what I was doing for BP, right? So, but once he said that to me, guess what? The light bulb went off and went, well, why not? So that's where my story comes from. It's sort of serendipity, I guess. You just never know, right? So
yeah, that's cool. You never do know. And as it turns out, that's it's a path that maybe you were on it the whole time and didn't know it, but either way, you've come to take all those wellness skills and your dance background, and you'll bring that forward into your career as an FBI agent, and then take that really to a whole new level, working with the groups that you did, and special operations, and with others. And that, what we were talking at TaserCon, John Dunn is one of the guests that we've had on the show, and He's a fellow Boilermaker, not a Badger. He's a Boilermaker. Uh, but he was telling me how much, he enjoyed that and how important that was. And there's someone that's coming from Air Force Special Operations to working at the highest level in tactical operations in law enforcement. So I was excited to talk about that, and I'm sure at some point here in the next hour we'll get back to that again and talk about why that's important. But pretty cool,
Yes.
pretty cool.
Yes, absolutely. Well, if you think about it, mindfulness and yoga, the movement practice related to mindfulness practices is yoga, is a big one, right? And that stuff's built for operators. It's built for men like John Donne. It's built for those guys. And so when I first started teaching, and we started with yoga, and maybe we can get into this later again, but when I first started teaching yoga after I retired for the hostage rescue team, we started with yoga. Very often police departments do the opposite, and they start with meditation, which I think is a really good idea because we don't have the shift work and the coming and goings a lot. We have a set full-time team. So it was really appropriate to just start with yoga, and they're physical beings, right? They're very physically strong, powerful, very mobile. They don't give up, all that kind of good stuff that you need to be the warriors that they are. So the yoga practice is a warrior practice. It's a warrior practice. And so it made perfect sense to just get past some of the Western myths and the stuff about, thin women and Lululemons doing all the Lululemon pants and all that stuff, doing yoga, which is totally fine, but that was never the intention of yoga. So it didn't surprise me that people like John gravitated towards it, and they noticed the benefits. And then eventually the whole mindfulness piece and the meditative and the breath, the breathing and the focusing on the body and moving out of the thinking mind and into the body, all of a sudden they start to realize that they're sleeping better, they're less emotional reactivity, they're more present for what's in front of them. So all that stuff starts to come together with this. So I wasn't surprised that it was accepted by the vast majority, but I was pleasantly surprised that I was allowed to do it. I was invited to do it. It was an honor, and it is an honor. It's an absolute pleasure to go there.
Yeah, and I came from on the law enforcement side. Early in my career, I was part of our SWAT team. I did that for a long time, and yeah, I was always into physical fitness from early point in my career. But it started out more on the traditional side where I would lift 5-6 days a week. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, chest and tris, back and bis, Wednesday legs, and then I would run separate from that. And I discovered CrossFit later in life, not until my late 30s. Still pretty early. I was a very early adopter of CrossFit, but when you start CrossFitting after you've been doing a typical gym movement, what you find is that your mobility is, at least from me, like it was terrible. Like as a kid, I remember being very flexible, but as an adult, you go a long time and you don't stretch, you don't do anything. I just couldn't get myself into like just a simple overhead squat, holding a bar overhead and trying to squat. I think it's still one of the reasons why I love CrossFit, for a lot of reasons, but that was one of the reasons I really thought like, wow, this is a full body exercise program. And my shoulder mobility, terrible. My hip flexors tight, legs tight. And I just realized, I'm like, man, I carry around this gun belt all day. I'm climbing in and out of the left side of my car, a lot, left knee pressure, lower back pain. And then it was, CrossFit just completely exposed me. And so my first exposure then to yoga was Mark Devine, who was a retired SEAL commander who started a U.S. CrossFit based out of California. But he had this, he was really the one that really kind of introduced these concepts of mindfulness and tactical mindfulness, box breathing, And I'm sure, I don't know whether he was the originator of a lot of these things, but I know I give him a lot of credit to creating a lot of exposure to that. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I eventually did become a believer in thought, but in practice, here's what I tell you. You want to know why a lot of more people don't do yoga?
Hmm.
Because it's hard.
Yeah, it is.
It looks easy, but it's freaking hard, and it is very uncomfortable. And it's like anything else in life, some of the greatest benefits in life are always right on the other side of fear and pain and
Yeah.
and agony.
Well, it's all that, that vulnerability piece, right? Emotional risk, emotional exposure, right? Of frankly, your shortcomings, your weaknesses. I even like to use weaknesses. That's not really the right word, but places that get uncomfortable are the places to focus on, and the yoga piece is a safe space to do that. And there's so many lessons you can take from that, from your yoga practice, just moving into that discomfort and working with distress in a safe way is just pretty incredible for your performance, because you work with discomfort and you work with it and go into spaces where you're vulnerable, and you might feel like you're not doing something right, and you notice the judgment that comes up because you feel like you look stupid or whatever it is. That's all part of the practice of yoga. That's all a piece of it.
So in your career, so you become an agent, and I'm sure you're doing like things that street agents are doing, right?
Yep.
You're working cases and doing the job, and then how does that, how do you wind up taking your previous life skills and then applying them to not only the HRT and what they're doing, but just bringing it to the FBI in a more broad sense?
How does it work? Yeah. Well, as we were just talking about, you and I are both physical people for our whole lives, right? And right around, fast forward 10 years into my career, right around 2007, I'll tell you this brief story because it segues directly into what I do now. 2007, I was a street agent in Cleveland. So I was about midway through my career. I was married to a wonderful man who happens to be one of my best friends in the world to this day. And things weren't going so hot, things were not working very well. And I also was working some cases that I just didn't feel like I had a purpose. I just didn't feel like I had a real purpose professionally or personally. So my professional life and my personal life were colliding at the same time. And that's a pretty awful place to be. And I began sort of numbing it with some maladaptive coping behaviors, like disengaging from my relationships, whether it was with my husband or even with some of my girlfriends, just sort of disengaging, pulling away from all those good things in life, not seeing the joy, seeing just all the negative things in life, right? Doing what your brain does, right? When you're full of stress and trauma. We went through one traumatic episode between the two of us that was very difficult to navigate. And that was the year prior to that in 2006. And so I hadn't addressed trauma that was still inside me because, I'm Suzanna, I'm fine. I'll get past all this stuff. I can make this work out. And so what, I get divorced, I'll just start over again and all this kind of stuff. And so my personal life and professional life were just going completely off the rails. So it was completely derailed. And so the maladaptive behaviors of not being engaged in life, not being present for what's happening to me so I could actually do something for myself, drinking too much, all that kind of stuff, that was exercising too much. All of a sudden, the thing I loved the most was becoming maladaptive, because I figured if I ran 5 miles and I feel better, what if I run 8? Maybe I'll feel better. What if I lift a half an hour longer? So I would injure myself, things like that, because I wanted to feel better so bad. I wasn't liking where I was. So fast forward from that, my husband and I separated. I moved to the DC area. I moved to Quantico, and I got a job, a wonderful job, the best assignment I had as a FBI National Academy instructor. So I know you had Corey McGuckin on here as one of your interviewees, and he was one of my colleagues back in the day. And so I worked as a National Academy instructor, loved every minute of it. And I started to find out that I wasn't alone, and in talking to cops and struggling with unprocessed stress and trauma, because the stress and trauma is not the demon. stress and trauma is part of life. And you might want to double that, I'm making that up, but kind of double that in law enforcement arenas, right? I mean, we're overly exposed to bad things, right?
Oh yeah,
And so
absolutely.
yeah, constantly. But there's so much joy out there. There's so much good, but our brain, we all have a negativity bias. So we're kind of built to see that. And then when you're full of this unprocessed stress and trauma that we know we have, we don't address it because it's not culturally really accepted to do that. You go down this path of numbing, right? But I started to notice that I wasn't alone. And for the longest time, I thought, what am I doing? I have this great job. I had this great husband. What the hell did I do to my life? Kind of thing. And so once I got to National Academy and started to discover this, I had to do my own work. And the physical fitness piece was great. And I kept doing that because that's super important, as we know, but it wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't quite doing the trick anymore. And everything around me was suffering emotionally and mentally and spiritually too. I was suffering. And I thought, I just don't want to feel this way anymore. I just didn't want to be this way anymore. So I started to look into what can I do? So this wonderful mindfulness piece came up, right? And I started my mindfulness journey with yoga because of the physicality of it. I started seriously practicing yoga. I had dabbled in it for years as a dancer, but it never quite took. I always say to my students that yoga comes to you. You don't always go to it. It'll find you somewhere when you most need it. But I really started seriously practicing yoga not terribly long ago, like in 2013, so about a decade ago. And then I started reading up on meditation. And I thought, and that's obviously incorporating all the breath work that we were doing and the breath awareness we were practicing in yoga. And then I met this outstanding pioneer. His name is Rich Gerling, out of Hillsboro, Oregon, and he's the founder of Mindful Badge. He is truly the pioneer in mindfulness in law enforcement and public safety. And I basically almost stalked him. I saw him on the cover of, not really, in a good way. I saw his photo on the cover of Mindful Magazine. I don't know if you read that, Patrick, but he was on the cover of Mindful Magazine as introducing mindfulness to his department and to other departments in Oregon. And so I cold called him. I called the department and they passed me through to his voicemail to Lieutenant Gerling, and he called me back. I think it was the same day he called me back, and we had this conversation. We nerded out for like an hour, had this great conversation about how he got into meditation. And so I eventually invited him to the National Academy, and that was around 2015. I invited him, and he came and he did a few blocks with some of my students, and I think it was a total of about 45-ish law enforcement officers, and it was very well received. It was like kind of weirdo back then, right? And even though that doesn't sound that long ago, 2015 was decades ago for mindfulness in law enforcement, as you know very well. It was kind of weird, right? And I'll be totally candid about it, is that I did get quite a bit of that kind of pushback from some of the bosses going, what is this weirdo agent doing? And why are we doing this? Why are we teaching meditation? Why are we doing yoga? And some of my coworkers too. And again, this was just the whole newness of it and just understanding. I wasn't doing very well at understanding where they were coming from, because there was an aspect of, what are you doing and why are you doing these strange things? And how does this work? How does this relate to law enforcement? And I realized I realized a little too late, but I realized that it was my responsibility to understand where they were coming from and for them to open up to understand me. So it's kind of a two-way, little bit of a standoff on that. But
when you get passionate about it, because we run into this all the time, right? And I was just as guilty of that as a young officer. When you're passionate about something, you're like, everybody should be doing this. Yeah. And then you charge forward and people are looking at you like, what the hell is Flanley talking about? And then you, when you have an opportunity, things kind of settle down, or you learn to see things from someone else's perspective. You're like, oh, okay, I get it. Then there's more than one idea. There's more than one perspective, I guess.
So. Yeah, exactly. I mean, you have to kind of put your ego in check. You really do. And you go, you know what? Maybe Suzanna, Patrick, you sit down, you understand, you look at it, like you said, from their perspective, and you go from a place of understanding so you can educate them in this area that you're so excited about. So why should they be excited about it just because you are? So I had to get past that myself because, and I think I'm going to mention this in Vegas in our conversation there, that I'm pretty sure that there were a few times that some of the executive management in the FBI wanted to kick me out of their office. Not, they never did, but when you get that feeling like, ooh, I think I might have said the wrong thing. That was me, or said the right thing in the wrong way, I think is what happened. So that was a rookie mistake. And I learned, and I was never, I don't feel bad about the fact about being assertive about it, because it's really, really important work to do. But, I had to learn, I had to go about it the right way. But the point is that the students, the cops themselves, in written feedback said, what is this, and why aren't we doing this more? This is a new place to go. Let's explore this. Basically, let's explore this a little bit more. That was the shining light for me, to move forward with it. And before even I got to that place where I was teaching this work to cops, I going back to doing my own work. So I had to build my own practice and dabble in meditation and find what works for me. And I've been asked so many times by police officers and by fellow agents, like, what's the right kind of practice to do? Well, the right kind of practice is the practice that you do, whatever you find that works for you. So I had to do my own work before I could go in and actually translate it for my students, and actually translate it for upper management in the FBI, because I needed their support. Obviously, I needed their support between, not just their emotional support, but I needed the resources to move ahead and do this work. So after I worked for the National Academy, and I moved back to the Critical Incident Response Group, where I had been there about 10 years earlier. So I was in the Crisis Management Unit, probably 10 years-ish into my career. And then I came back at the end of my career. That's where I retired out of. And I had a wonderful unit chief at the time, and he said, why don't you start talking about this work with our special agents in charge? And so I was given a block of training, unheard of, right? And talking about mindfulness and performance and how this works. And I all of a sudden I got a lot of interest from the SACs. And so when I was ready to retire, I was ready to move on, and I had no intention of coming back to the Bureau, really. But my unit chief said, not because I was upset with him, it's because I was ready to move on and do this kind of work in mindfulness. This is what I wanted to do. I found really what I wanted to do. I was such a big believer in it. And he said, why don't you come back and do some of that work here? Part of it, why don't you keep moving forward and doing it? And I went, great. So I came back. And then kind of almost simultaneously, there's a human performance coordinator who is one of the most awesome human beings I've ever met. And he's on the hostage rescue team. And he kind of heard about what I was doing, and I heard about what he was doing. He was setting up a very forward-leaning, had set up a very forward-leaning human performance program. He's former special forces himself, working with them, instituting what they were doing into the hostage rescue team and making it specific for these elite operators. And he said that the one piece that he wanted to focus on was the mental aspects that were not using technology, right? The organic mental fitness, like what can we do? One was meditation, one was yoga, and talking a little bit more about the spiritual side of it. But it was really more, how can we infuse this into the training at HRT? So that was ironic. At the same time that Crisis Management Unit hired me back, and I was allowed to, and from our executive management at Critical Incident Response Group, our assistant director then had asked me, told me, keep doing this. Something is working. He was very forward leaning. He said, something is working. Something's going on that we need to explore. So I'm so grateful for leaders like that who really just go forward and go do it, Suzanna. I don't know what you're doing, but something's working. So going to HRT, I started yoga classes a couple times a week, and it started to pick up steam. And that's pretty much how that happened. And all of a sudden now I'm pretty much a fixture over there. Then it blossomed into training SWAT teams. And between myself and a colleague of mine named Tim Harrison, another colleague, Rick Krause. I'm saying these names on purpose because they deserve it. And another colleague of mine, Kevin Kelly, who was a senior team leader for SWAT out in San Francisco. Rich Gerling out in Oregon, like I mentioned, going back to Chad McGehee at the University of Wisconsin-Madison from Inner Edge Meditation. We kind of converged and created a team called Peak. And this Peak training was based out of CIRG. And this is when we started to train our SWAT teams. And our courses ended up being 2 days of literally meditation, yoga, and talking about how to be a healthier, richer, and I mean rich in richness of spirit, and kind, compassionate human being. How does this training make you not just a better operator, a better agent? How does this training make you a better human, better at relationships, better spouse, better father, better mother, better sibling? And so that's how that all happened. And it just sort of blossomed, and the SWAT teams really took to it, which like I mentioned earlier, I'm not hugely surprised because it's built for them. It's built for them. So it's really important, the team of people that we had together who had done this work before and or were researchers or specialists in it, it was really important to have the right group of people who had a passion for this stuff and build this grassroots training program. So I'm actually really proud of it.
As you should be. And everything, I think in life is like this. Things that you resist at times, you don't really understand why you're resisting it. Maybe it's fear, maybe it's something else. Maybe there's financial barriers or time barriers or whatever. But when you get there and then you look back, it's kind of like, oh my gosh, why didn't I do this? Why didn't I do this earlier? I wish someone would have forced me to do this earlier. And I just kind of had this conversation with a group in Indiana just the other day in terms of using a coach, right? Using an executive coach. And it was, where I was always engaged on the fitness side and, working out and training and, studying, reading, being a lifelong learner, all those types of things. But one thing I had never used was a coach. And the coach is the one that can kind of direct you in areas that you don't necessarily want to go, but you probably know that you need to, these accountability partners. And I think there's a lot of reasons why all this stuff is so important. But number one, the most important reason, at least in my mind, is that if you want to be the best at what you're doing in policing, then you have to be centered. Like you've got to be, you got to be firing on all cylinders. You have to be in absolute control of your emotions, of really, of your life. And policing is not geared necessarily to line up to, for that just to kind of happen like most people's lives are. And not to say that other people don't have difficult jobs and stress and all those things, but when you're working shift work, when you're dealing with trauma all day long, when you're dealing with other people's negative emotions and negative energy all the time, I mean, that's just like, it just like drapes on you like a cape, that just gets wet and it gets heavier and heavier. And if you don't shed that thing from time to time and really kind of check in with yourself, then, it's not a matter if things are going to go bad. It's probably just really a matter of when and then how bad might it be. So I give you a ton of credit for what you're doing. And, the last thing I'll say, and then we can kind of move on, is, and I know it was this way with the FBI, but, in policing 20, 30 years ago, it was very difficult to find jobs in these professions. And now we can't find enough people to do it. And the people that are in these professions are leaving, and they're leaving, sooner. They're leaving, and they're not leaving happy, right? They're coming into these jobs where they want to make a difference. They want to help. And next thing you know, 5, 10, 20 years later, if they're not dying early, they're leaving, they're sad, they're angry. And I had another episode where I was talking with Dr. Laura King, and I don't know if you've met Laura or not.
I have not.
She she gave me this story about her own father, who, the job just broke him, and he's still alive, he's still around, and she still has a connection with him. But she just recognized very early on in her career, like she had an example of what not to become, that motivated her to do things not only better for her, but to bring that, she's also a police chief now, to be able to bring these things to her agency. And so it's exciting now, because I think these things are becoming mainstream. People are accepting them in ways that they never used to. And sometimes it just takes people like Suzanna to go in and bug the shit out of her bosses.
I'm good at that. I'm good at that. You can ask pretty much any boss I've ever had in the last 25 years. I'm going to say, oh God, not her again. Can we please just give her this so she just gets out of my office? And I love it. And I love that. I want to add to that healthy minds make healthy decisions. And to me, it's that simple. It's that simple and that difficult. But, we spend so much time on and this is all good stuff that we need to do, but we spend so much time on physical fitness and tactics and investigative training and firearms and all that stuff that we need to do. So I'm not discounting any of that by any way, shape, or form. But why are we not equally stressing the mental fitness? Because you mentioned early that, you have these instruments like taser, this wonderful instrument like taser, and then you're behind this lethal weapon called a gun. And then you have your mouth, which can be equally lethal. You have your body, which can be lethal, right? And then behind all of that is your mind. And behind every decision you make is your mind. I mean, to make it, that sounds kind of stupid, but that's what it is. There's a human behind every piece of that. You can have the best technology in the world. It won't matter if you have an unhealthy mind behind it. And so why are we not focusing on this? So there's no excuses, Patrick. There just isn't. There's too much data behind it. Now, maybe I would have given a little bit of leeway 5-10 years ago, when we didn't have the data we have now to support not just mindfulness practices in general, but mindfulness practices for law enforcement. We have data to back it up now. We also have data from quite a while ago from John Violanti in Buffalo saying that, in his data, that not you might, not you will, not maybe, but you will be stress injured. So we already know this. The data supports that we're going to be stress injured. So why are we not looking at stress and trauma as part of the experience of being a law enforcement officer, not being a victim to it, but by working with it and understanding that this will happen because the data supports it? And so in order to address that, starting early with mental fitness, using the technology and all that great stuff is awesome. And that's wonderful. That in tandem with the organic work of meditation, yoga, gratitude practice, finding joy in your life, all those really important practices that are all backed by research. Why are we not instituting that into our academies? Starting that expression cradle to grave kind of thing. I don't really like that expression, but starting early. And these are practices that our folks deserve and that our officers and our agents need. They just need to be a better law enforcement officer.
Yeah, so John Violanti, he just updated his book, "Dying for the Job." He's put more data in there, and I was talking to you before the show, but I was recently did an interview with Mike Malpass, and people can refer to his book. But he's written several books. He's a retired Phoenix police officer, Phoenix SWAT. He was an MMA fighter, and he really got into the neuroscience and studying the information that is out there about how to optimize performance. And so he had probably one of the best expressions that I've heard. I can't believe I've never heard this before, but it's like the mind is a prediction machine, and if it's working well, and these are my words, just kind of paraphrasing a discussion with him, but if things are going well, your predictions are going to go well. But if it's not, then you're going to be in trouble. And so when we talk about making decisions under stress, making decisions under pressure, making decisions when you're tired, when you maybe if you have unresolved physical trauma or emotional trauma, if the prediction machine gets a little gets a kink in it, then it can create problems, and then you start making bad predictions or false predictions, and that's generally what gets cops in trouble. And we're really good at publicly. We're really good at pointing the finger at where we've gone wrong and where we've done bad, and we like to point those things out and ridicule. But where we're not necessarily good is pointing at what's the source of all the trauma, what's the source of all the problems, why are cops dying so young, why are they leaving the profession in droves, why can't we get people to come in? It's because people on the inside are no longer they're no longer telling people or sharing the joys with the job, because they really are focused on the negative. And again, I think that's just another aspect of why what you're doing is so important, so we can change this moving forward, like where we can build a culture around this practice and these types of practice that can create that holistic officer approach, the hire healthy, retire healthy.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Maximize that.
The holistic is key, Patrick. And some other expressions I hear, kind of segueing off what you said, is that that cops are broken, or the stress and trauma broke them and they need to be fixed. Nobody's broken and needs to be fixed. And in my opinion, we need to get out of that lane of language, because it's killing us doing that. And we need to look at what John Violante did long ago, that we will be injured in this area. We will have stress injuries. So instead of saying that we're broken and we need to be fixed, and this comes from internally in organizations saying, oh God, that Patrick, that Suzanna, they used to be such great law enforcement officers, and wow, what happened to them? They're not doing what they used to do. And then we sort of get pushed off to the side, or that person's struggling and having issues, let's kind of put them off to the side. We're not broken, and we're not fit. We don't need fixing. What we need is support, and we need the skill sets to navigate an arena that's very difficult. And I'm so glad we've come as far as we have. Going back to National Academy, there's a course now, and it's deep in the curriculum that they meditate and they do these practices now. So we've come a long way in just those handful of years, but we're not even close. But we just have to keep this going and maybe start changing the language around stress and trauma. Not to say accept it. I mean, I guess acceptance is the right word, but just be vulnerable enough to accept the fact that this will affect you, and you're not going to be broken. It doesn't mean you're weak. All that kind of stuff that drives all of us nuts, right? That's killing us. And just say, this is going to happen. So now what, right? Just like, I need a knee replacement. My knees are all banged up. So I get a knee replacement. Let's get that. Let's fix it. That kind of thing. Let's get that mended. Let's heal it. Right. It's the same thing with the mental training. But if we wait until, which I believe is my opinion, is what we're doing now. We're waiting till officers, fall off the ledge. And then they're already into the throes of suicidal ideation and PTSD and tremendous deep dark depression, and you name it, all the drill, right? We need to do that. We need to address that, no question about it. But if you think about it, there's a long way, and if I put it in from my experience, there's a long distance between a brand new agent that comes in with vim and vigor and really wants to, like you said, they really come in for the right reasons, they want to do the right thing, to suicidal ideations. There's that whole gap in there that we could be addressing. Those minds that are healthy, and they're healthy and they're staying healthy, and people are doing they're being the best law enforcement officer they can, and they still have that positive nature to them that can get eroded by this unprocessed stress and trauma. We're not dealing with the prehabilitative side, like the pre-incident, prehabilitative. we're always focusing on the post-critical incident, which we need to. Again, I do not dissuade that, but isn't there room for both in our profession? There has to be. We have to make room for it and open our minds to the fact that, training is the first thing that gets cut, basically, in my organization, in your organization, probably your old organization. Something has to get cut, right? So when that happens, some of the things that first get cut are things like this, like looking at the resilience. We say it's important, either it is or it isn't. So it's important to, as my friend, the human performance coordinator at HRT says, he said, you protect your human capital, just like you protect people on the street, just like you protect your family. It's protecting your human capital. And I do believe that. And you start early. And I think that'll make a big difference. It's a cultural shift, and it's not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, I love the way you just said that, the prehab versus rehab, and you have to be able to do both. And that, anyone that's, if you've been involved in athletics or now, if you look at a professional athlete in the way that they prepare themselves for a long career, the Tom Brady's of the world and others, how is it that a guy like Tom Brady can be successful into his 40s? Well, it's because he's got the right type of support, and he's doing all these things to prepare himself for the profession. Now, granted, it's, maybe it's not the best analogy, but
it is. It's a great analogy, actually. Go ahead.
Well, only in terms of, professional athlete is going to have, where financially the resources are always going to be there for them, and those organizations are going to put forth that. But I think that's kind of to your point, like, as organizations, we really needed to fight for these dollars to invest in our people right from day one. And I know it's tough from the academy level, because you have a fixed period of time for when you're going to have a recruit. And I spoke with our executive director from the Indiana Law Enforcement Academy on the podcast, Tim Horty. And, the challenge is that if you're not working there, sometimes it's easy to question, well, what are they doing there? But once you spend some time there, I was on our training board for a couple of years, and I got that perspective that I didn't have before. Like we were talking about earlier, like, oh my gosh, yeah. So you have officers that are coming from large departments and small departments, and what we're teaching them to is a base level of training it's going to give them a base level of proficiency. We're not training advanced police officers, we're training basic police officers. And if we want officers to hit the streets at a more advanced level, then guess what? We've got to spend more time and money on the front end to get them to that. And I think that's kind of where there's a big understanding in America now that we have to invest more up front if we're going to demand these professional types of police officers that we expect and quite frankly we deserve in our communities. Then we have to invest in them, and we got to give them these tools. So I
Yes.
love that. I love the prehab rehab. So with that in mind, right? If I were to say, all right, Suzanna, I know nothing about yoga and mindfulness, but I believe you. It sounds like this is something that's great, that's going to help my agency. But what do I do? How do I start? Where do I go?
I would suggest now, police departments are obviously set up different than the FBI, but let me tell you from my perspective what we have found to find some success. And first of all, you start small, and you start with a pilot program of people who want to be there. That when I hear mandatory mindfulness training, which I have heard in the past, that's a recipe for like a disaster, not good. So you start with small groups, and in our case, we started with our tactical operators because that's what it's built for, and they were very concerned about their performance as an operator, and then all of a sudden they equate it to their lives at home. But a big reason we started there is because they're the informal, frankly, they're some of the most highly respected informal leaders in our organization. And so guess what? Once they kind of take a little bite of the practice and you introduce the right, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but the who delivers it, how it's delivered, and why it's delivered, going into those points with these guys. But let me come back to that in a second. When we got our SWAT guys, they're this audience that takes this information back and they start talking about it. And then another population hears about it. Other investigators hear about it. Maybe your dispatchers hear about it. And then all of a sudden the information and the conversation starts to percolate, and then they want to do it. The issues that I've seen where it fails is that it's a cookie cutter, one size fits all kind of training where you just bring everybody into a room. We're going to have mandatory mindfulness, mandatory yoga from 1 to 2 o'clock, and then people show up who don't want to be there. That's like, like I said, the recipe for disaster. And then you have somebody that comes in there that teaches, that has no idea what it's like to work in the law enforcement world. They can't relate. They don't have stories to relate back to them. They don't have a method. It's not their fault, but they don't have a method to teach police officers why this is important for their profession, because they don't have the background to do it. They don't have frankly, the bona fides to go in and talk about why this is important for law enforcement. So my point in all that is saying is that you need to decide how you're going to devise this training program, teach people why this is important, right? And the other importance is who delivers it. So you could have, say, a bunch of really awesome Navy SEALs come in and do this training who really know what they're doing. And then they're teaching maybe frontline healthcare workers, say, for instance, getting out of the law enforcement arena, frontline healthcare workers, and the healthcare workers are going, huh? Because there's no relationship. So it's really important who delivers it and customizing it for your audience. So I'm not quite sure if I'm fully answering your question. Number one, it's difficult, but number two, you always want to start small. And I know departments, once things get exciting and they're like, let me try it, it becomes too big, too fast, and it fails because it's too vanilla. It's too vanilla, and it's taught by people who don't relate to their audience. Does that make sense? Or
no, I think it makes perfect sense. Policing has a lot of unique stressors in it that a lot of other people aren't going to see or experience, and sometimes it can be kind of off-putting when cops make jokes or they try to make light of things that the gallows humor comes in. In this day and age, you say the wrong thing at the wrong moment, and it's all it's another one of those gotcha moments that people are waiting around for. So,
well, it's really important. I mean, you're right. It's really important to know how to speak to a law enforcement audience and when you can sort of relax and let loose and be part of their vernacular, and when to pull back. It's really important to do that. There's been many mistakes done in law enforcement where you have the wrong person being in front of a crowd teaching mindfulness. And guess what happens? The folks in the audience that get turned off, you know how hard it is to get them back? It's really hard. You don't have too many chances because we're a tough audience. We pull the bullshit card up really fast, right? We all know this, right? We all know this. So you really have to have reputable people who have a track record for teaching law enforcement. So, and a lot of it comes from asking around, literally getting on Google and finding out who's doing this, finding reviews, and not just going by what the internet says, but actually doing some research. Who is this Suzanna Hasnay? Who is this Chad McGeehee, Rich Gerling, Kevin Kelly? Who are these people and what have they done? And get on the phone, talk to them. I have seen even in my organization, just hiring people just to bring them in to do this type of training. It doesn't work. It just doesn't work. It might be fun for an hour, but to really help shape the culture and shift it, you have to have people who are reputable in their arena of training mindfulness specifically for law enforcement and or high performers. To me, that's been the recipe, and there's some data to back that up as well. Customizing the training, really important, and starting small, very key.
Well, I think anytime, like you said, those informal leaders, once you get them buying in and really committing to something, that you'll see things start to spread. a little bit more organically throughout the organization.
Yeah.
But
I call it top down, bottom up. It start with, I think I told you I was invited to do blocks with the special agents in charge just to kind of pique their interest, so to speak. And then the bottom up, and I don't mean bottom, I mean just like the regular street agents, right? They're the ones that really are the roots of the whole thing. So if you start top down, so they understand what's happening, then the bottom up, once you get the buy-in, I don't even like that word, but the buy-in of this kind of training from your troops, frankly, you know how hard that's going to be to take it away? Really hard, because they're going to be like, boss, what do no, law enforcement complain about it? Never, right? So, but yeah, once that takes root for them, that's when the cultural shift changes. Frankly, the bosses come and go. And I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but the bosses do come and go. But you have the ranks from the bottom who are going to be there. In the Bureau's case, you have these agents or street officers that's what they want to do. And they're going to be there for 20, 25 plus years. And they're the ones that are going to be just priceless in getting this taken root. I just spoke to a brand new agent yesterday, just graduated from the academy, I don't know, like a month or two ago, something like that. He had sat through a training course that I have done and for the new agent training academy. And he sat through a really short course. It was like an hour or so. And he was intrigued by it. He was a former Army guy. And he had the wherewithal to like track us down, right? And say, hey, I don't want to say what city he's in, but I'm in this particular office, and do you have any resources up here? And so, I found some resources for him up there to explore this whole mindfulness arena. That, I could have a big, huge smile on my face talking to him, because that is the future. This is the young guy, right? Yep. Coming in going, I want to know more about this, right? Because I don't want what happened to so-and-so who retired 5 years ago. I don't want to be like that guy who left unhealthy, unhappy, broken up marriages, relationship issues. I don't want to be that guy, right? I don't want to be that guy. He already had the wherewithal to go. There's got to be something that I can do for me. And in terms of like the cost is, mindfulness doesn't cost anything. Once you get the training in and once you get it infused, if you really think about it, you don't need a whole lot of fancy stuff, to do this. Yep. But you need to invest in the right trainers. And the goal of it, and my friend, human performance coordinator at HRT, he and I talk about this all the time, that one of the highlights of teaching yoga there for a little over 5 years now is that a bunch of the guys are now going off and finding private studios to go to. They're deployed somewhere, and guess what they do in their off times? They go find a yoga class. They practice yoga online. That was, honestly, that was my dream. I don't need you to come to me all the time. It's not about me. This is about you. And so if you are doing that, that means it's infused into the daily rhythms of your life now. And that's where these young guys, like who I spoke to yesterday, that's the future of this, is really getting those internal champions who are going to be there for a while to rise up and keep the message going. Because I don't plan on being like a 70-year-old yoga instructor for tactile operators. And it's not that far away, frankly. So that's not my dream. My dream is to help shape the culture for it, to give it a lane of respect and importance.
So while we're chatting here, I'm going to grab a book, and I've got a couple of them here, and just using myself as kind of like, again, an N of one, and that's kind of where a lot of my my crazy paths go. I'm a bit of a geek when it comes to technology and data, and I like to have measurables. And that one of the things that I found, particularly when it comes to yoga, mindfulness, is that I use a Muse headset, but I don't always use it. And I find that sometimes it's better to not use it every single time, because then you start getting focused on the data and not necessarily on the process. And the process is, I think, is where the magic is. And speaking of Mark Divine, I was listening to his podcast, and Amisha Jha was on there, and it was, and so I read her book, and And then I went back and I started to use my Muse headset again, and I found like just experimenting, just trying, and we're talking 10 to 15 minute sessions. I think the longest session I've ever done is 30 minutes. But and I'll just use, and again, as an N of one, I would try, when I was working, I would try to come home for lunch as much as I could. I don't live very far from my office, so I could come home. And then during COVID, there were times where, of course, when I was quarantined several times, I found that if I just did like a 10 to 15 minute session right before I went back to the office, like before I leave the house, just sit down. Yeah, I would just eat a sandwich or something real quick and eat a salad, sit down for 10, 15 minutes and go. I found that I can actually get into a state of calm. The more I did it, the quicker I could get into a state of calm. And I had, number one, I could feel it, but two, then I also started to have some measurables. And then so I like to use the technology, but I know that I benefit when I don't use it as well, if that makes sense. So I'm just, I bring this up because I'm just thinking for someone that might be listening to this, like, hey, my organization is not going to provide a yoga instructor. They're not going to provide a mindfulness coach. So therefore, if they're not going to give it to me, then I'm not going to do it. Which I don't think is the right approach either, because a lot of these things, it really just kind of takes some individual, responsibility and accountability to kind of seek them out on your own too, because it's your life, right? And you got to take control of your life and your outcomes. And, you can't be the victim in your own play. And that's what I like about what you were mentioning earlier, right? Is like, we're not broken. We don't need to be fixed. We just need to be fine-tuned and tuned up from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah. And going back to what you said, if your department's not going to offer that, which I totally agree, that hopefully that changes when leadership shifts, because that's, again, I'll go back to the leadership issue. It's so important for these practices to be infused into the culture of your department. But when I look at that, often it's just informal conversations, like in the squad room, with your partner, just talking about, hey, have you tried this yoga class down the street? Or, I'm using this app. It's on Insight Timer or Calm or Headspace or whatever one you choose. And those conversations are really helpful, because that kind of word spreads. And there's always going to be the officers that think that's kind of a weirdo thing, and so be it. So we're not going to get to everybody. That will happen. But eventually, the hope is that some brave soul brings that up to leadership and says, "Hey, boss, I know this yoga instructor from my studio. He or she is willing to come in and just have a couple classes with us, and or like a mindfulness instructor. There's more than you think. There's more mindfulness and yoga instructors out there that are very law enforcement friendly and want to give back and want to support our community." And there's organizations out there that will do it. There's veterans organizations that will do it, and they'll also help out law enforcement organizations with issues like that, of finding the right instructors to come in. But like you said, it's it is individual too, but it is the onus of the organization to take the leadership in this. And so, to answer your question, it doesn't really answer it that well. But I think we're in a place where, dare I say it, that is just not an option. That is just not an option. I mean, if we're still back there going, we're not even going to try this because we can't spend $100 to bring in a yoga instructor to work with our guys for 1 hour or half an hour, whatever it is, I don't even know what to tell you, because we're so beyond that in terms of the need that it's just too important to sort of push it off to the side and go, we're just not going to do that. We can't afford it. You can't afford not to do it. So I'm just a real hardliner about that.
Well, I think too, we hear a lot about, training for emotional intelligence, training for, how do you improve your EQ, your emotional quotient. And this is probably, if not the best way, one of the best ways to improve an individual's emotional intelligence. And we hear about this all the time. There's training that is appearing that, hey, look, maybe we need to screen for these kind of traits. Officers, agents that have a higher level of emotional intelligence are performing better on the job. They're making better decisions. They're more compassionate. They show more appropriate empathy. So if we're looking for those things, then here's a very direct and approach to how to improve it.
It's directly related. Emotional intelligence is the underlying foundation of resilience. It really is. I mean, the self-awareness piece, the self-management piece, the emotional regulation piece, all that sounds really familiar for mindfulness training. That's the foundational part of mindfulness, is knowing yourself, knowing how you affect others, emotional reactivity, all that good stuff that every officer should have the respect to get that training. And our profession should have enough respect for our own officers to have that training for them. It's really a matter, in some cases, life or death, because what officers are doing to themselves. And the other side of it is how officers relate to the community. If we have a little bit of a PR problem, and so addressing an officer's emotional intelligence and addressing their ability to make decisions, healthy decisions under stress, pressure, and trauma is imperative for our profession. I love law enforcement. I love it. And at the same time, I get so frustrated with some of the conversations around blaming media or blaming politicians or whatever. I mean, can we please get past that and focus on what we need to do to change, and what we need to do, what I mean by change, to change us for the better. And I know I'm a little bit biased in this direction, but why don't we start by training our officers' minds and putting a real emphasis on that, so we can just better navigate the difficulties of being a law enforcement officer. We just take ownership of it, because we can't control what other people are saying about us, but we can control is how we treat ourselves, because that will translate out into the public.
All right. So then we'll switch gears. I know we've been going for a while already. I knew this was going to happen. So
we're nerding out, Patrick.
All right. So for an officer that, again, I'll go back to this. My organization isn't going to provide something like this. What would be your recommendations for someone that's curious about it and they're wanting to get started? What would you say that steps that they take and to get started on their own?
Couple things is books, read. Podcasts like yours. Almost everybody's into listening to podcasts, videos. Start doing your own research. There's a lot of good stuff in there. You can Google mindfulness and law enforcement and you see just a myriad of things on there, and start by those basic, simple things, and don't necessarily believe everything you read and what you see. Just start to take it all in, and you will gravitate towards the resources that work for you. So that's the number one thing, is start reading. Grab a buddy, go to a yoga studio, test out a couple different instructors. They're not all going to be your cup of tea. So find the one that may work for you. Go to a yoga studio, talk to the yoga teachers in that studio. There are tremendous resources in this area of training, tremendous resources. Many of them, certainly in my area, I live in Fredericksburg, Virginia, certainly at my studio. I teach at a local studio as well, called Dragonfly Yoga Studio. Shout out to them. Awesome. There's several of those instructors who are former military. There's 3 of us who are former law enforcement. There's resources out there to be had. Apps, I'm not as much of an app person. I do use Insight Timer once in a while, but experiment with apps and see what works for you. There's a great one at the University of Wisconsin-Madison too. Experiment with some of those apps. Self educating, right? deep reflection for yourself. What is that? My colleague Chad McGee, he always said that experience plus reflection equals learning. Just having the experience of being a law enforcement officer, you don't necessarily learn from that. You reflect on your experiences in order to learn. So just start being curious. That expression of being curious about your life and not judging what you feel. That's all part of the mindfulness realm. Being curious about being a better person. All of us can improve, and we go through fits and starts where we're in the deep bowels of negativity, and all of a sudden we're in the high highs of an amazing life. And we have to be aware that that's normal and that happens, and stay curious to it, and just be lifelong learners in this. And I know I get really passionate about it, and I keep going on and on about it, but self-reflection and self-study is the foundational piece to answer the question, why do I feel like this? And I don't want to feel like this anymore. So what can I do about it? And if your department's not doing about it, unfortunately, if that's what it is right now, hopefully that's going to change soon. Do your own work and start disregarding what other people say, and just move into it, and become an internal champion for your organization. And that's going to be really helpful for the shift in culture.
So if I've never done yoga before, and I just kind of looked and I tell people this, like, if you're going to start, like, I use the example of CrossFit all the time. I was just talking about this the other day, but if you've never done CrossFit and you're thinking about doing it, a lot of times people used to come, or they would tell us, oh, well, yeah, I think I'm going to do CrossFit, but I'm going to lose weight first. I want to go get in shape, and then I'm going to come do CrossFit. And it's like, no, it's not the way it works. Like, come in here and let us coach you, let us help you. And the example that I gave was that a lot of times you can do a lot of things on your own. But if you've got a good coach or someone that's available to you, then it's better to do that up front. Find people that can teach you, and then maybe try to do it on your own afterwards. I think it accelerates the learning curve. But either way, you are going to have to do what's comfortable to you. So should someone, like, all right, I've never done yoga. Should I do it once a week? Should I plan on 3 times a week? Does it really matter, or is it just important to just get started?
No, just get started, because what we do, Patrick, is we put a whole lot of pressure on ourselves to, how do I do this right? So how many times should I do this? How long should I meditate? The practice that works is the practice that you do, period. So if yoga only works for you because of your schedule and other things in our life, once a week, once a month, it doesn't matter. Just do it. Just start it, because it's a habit, right? And so it takes a while to build a habit, but we have to go and find what works for us and find the practices that work for us. There's no right or wrong way of doing this. We put pressure on ourselves, like you just said, maybe I should lose weight before I work out, right? Which is complete, like, what, or I'm not very flexible, so I need to get more flexible. I've heard this from somebody. I need to get more flexible before I go to yoga. Literally stuff like that. When you really look at that, if you really would listen to yourself, you go, why did I say that? That doesn't even make any sense, So basically, just taking yourself there, that is the first step, like jumping off the deep end and go. Take a friend, go try it, and see what happens. There's no right or wrong, because you're already on the path to the mindfulness practice that's going to work for you, but you won't know it if you don't try it. You don't know until you try. Always just go and try. You're gonna feel stupid sometimes, and you're gonna say, am I doing this right? There is no right or wrong. So that would be my advice. Anyway, go ahead. I'm sorry, I can tell you.
No, that's perfect. And I think that's also, if you go one place and you didn't enjoy it, or you didn't like it, then try another one, and then do that again. There's do it until you find the one where you do feel comfortable, or that you think you found something that's going to work best with your schedule and something that you can commit to.
Yeah, find something that works for you, and again, ask around. And if there's a fellow officer that's going to a yoga class, maybe you hook up with him or her and go to the class, and go try it with him or her. Because sometimes, that, the safety in numbers kind of thing, when you feel kind of awkward, just makes you feel better. And there's meditation training and meditation centers. Many of them are affiliated with universities. Check out like a big university nearby and see what's going on there. Just that's the beauty of the internet now, right? Just start doing some research on there. And then if you find that a local university is affiliated with a meditation center or offers training in that, go for it. Just go for it. Give them a call. And even if they don't offer training for you, they have the resources that they can tell you, hey, go check this out in this city. This is who we talk to. This is who we use. Just try it that way. It does take some time, but just like a fitness program, you got a physical fitness program, you find what works for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, so the other thing when it comes to mindfulness and maybe practicing or starting a practice like that, if you just pick up your phone and do a quick search on mindfulness apps, go to the App Store and look at meditation or mindfulness, and you're going to see about 1,000 apps in there. And yeah, there's probably a benefit to any one of them. I think there's good ones out there. I think the first one that I used was Calm. Mm-hmm. And that one I think is probably one of the more prolific ones. You see, professional athletes and others on ads for it, but there's sessions on there like the Muse one that I use. There's beginner practices. You literally just put in a pair of headphones and they'll walk you through them, and you can learn a ton. I've just some of them there are sessions that are 5 to 6 minutes at a time. You can do longer ones, but there's a lot of simple ways to do it.
Start short. If you have a meditation teacher or even a yoga teacher that starts you off with a 15 or 20 minute meditation, that's going to be extremely difficult. It's just like never running before, and then somebody takes you out for a 15-minute run. It's very unpleasant. So it's just starting in small bursts, like 2 to 3 minutes at a time, and just seeing what that feels like. Just sit with your breath and look up those short meditations, like you said, on apps if you want a little bit more guidance for it. And a big, as you know, the big part of the practice is noticing that when judgment emerges, saying I can't do this, or my mind's wandering, and I'm thinking about my grocery list or whatever it is, and that's totally normal. And knowing that that's okay. And part of the practice, it's like reps in the weight room. Keep coming back to whatever that anchor is, or whatever the guide is telling you. Always coming back. There is absolutely no way you can do meditation wrong. I mean, there's no way. So,
and I'm proof of that. Because if there was a way to do it wrong, I'd be doing it wrong, or I'd have been doing it wrong for a long time before I figured out how to do it right.
How to do it right. And, and I want to add one more thing, because it segues off of what we're talking about of starting out a practice, is that there's so much marketing going on with mindfulness now. And there's I listened to a podcast about McMindfulness. I don't know if you ever heard that. I think there's a whole book on that, but McMindfulness, and just it's a huge, multi-million-dollar business, right? And so the thing about what's getting misinterpreted about mindfulness, that it's, this gentle, calming practice. And much of the time it's not. Mindfulness, when you really sit with your body and sit with happening in your body, it's work. I mean, it's work. Now, the affective outcome of it can absolutely be relaxation and calm, but the practice of mindfulness, sometimes when you sit there and you meditate, it's essentially the last thing sometimes you want to do, because you're so full of stress and trauma and pressure. You have a big briefing to do in an hour, and the last thing you want to do is sit there and be still and breathe. And it can be very frustrating. Sometimes it can be boring. Sometimes you have high expectations, like you meditate for 5 minutes and that didn't work, one of those. Well, just like reps in the weight room, if you want to be a better runner, you got to run. If you want to be a better shot with firearms, you got to go shoot. It's the same thing. It's a practice. It's not I don't even like to use the word tool that much. It's not a tool where you take a hammer and you hit the nail and you're done. It's not, and it works. Oh God, everything sticks together and it works. That's not what it is. It's a skill. It's a skill, just like shooting, just like running, just like, it's an activity that has to be honed and practiced in order for it to be effective. And the same thing, like working out, when you feel like, it's not working, I'm not getting stronger. But if you keep at it and it becomes a habit in your brain, you keep at it, all of a sudden you start noticing the results. So with meditation, if you think about it, it takes time. It takes years, and we know it's going to take years. And the more you do it, the faster the faster that you're going to notice the results. But eventually, if you keep at it and it becomes habituated in your brain to have some kind of practice, even if it's a few minutes a day, I will wager that you'll start to notice that you're sleeping better. Maybe you're making better eating choices. Maybe you notice when you're drinking too much, stuff like that. You notice when you're being short with your partner, when you're kind of, snapping at them because you're full of anger or whatever is going on with you. You start to notice that. All of a sudden, you'll start to notice that. And this comes from direct conversations I've had with some of the guys that I work with, that they've noticed over the years that they relate to their kids better. They're less apt to, like gas off on their kids because they're stressed out about something else. They fall asleep better. They stay asleep longer, things like that. But again, it takes time. Just like you don't lose weight overnight. And if you do, guess what? 99% of the time it comes back, right? So the same thing with this. You keep working at it, see what happens. There's no shortcuts. Unfortunately, if there were shortcuts, I would have found it, but there isn't.
No excuses, no shortcuts.
Correct.
I like it.
Correct.
That'll be that's a good t-shirt right there.
It's probably been done, I'm guessing, but
well, I know no excuses. I had that printed on the wall in our CrossFit gym, and I know that no shortcuts that's pretty much anything in life.
Absolutely, anything worth doing. Yeah.
Well, that's for sure, right? And just like you said, sometimes we don't get into bad places overnight. So sometimes we're not going to get out of them overnight, and bad places might not be a good thing or a good way to express it, but. All right.
So, place. Yeah, go ahead.
So we've been going for a while. I think now we've given people a little bit of some takeaways on how to get started, where I can do this, why it might be important, some things to consider. Anything else that you think we need to bring up before we wrap it up?
I want to say thank you to you for doing this and for getting the word out in all your podcasts, because this whole area of performance, mind, body, spirit, is a place that, in my love of law enforcement, it's a place that we finally need to go to, and so I appreciate people like yourself who are just doing some great work and are giving back to our community. So I want to thank you for that.
Well, I appreciate it. And I thank you for sharing your knowledge and your expertise, and most importantly, your story. I think that will resonate with a lot of people. The most important time to get started on this might have been yesterday, right? The next the next most important time might be today. So
I love that.
Either way, all right, just get started. Don't wait for anyone else's approval. Don't ask for anyone else's approval. You don't need it, and do it for yourself. And these things can be as simple as sitting in a tree stand without your phone for an hour, sitting in a boat fishing, right? There's a reason why people seek these things out. And a lot of times you don't necessarily even realize it until you have those moments where you're not looking at your phone, you're not being interrupted, no one's knocking at your door, type of things, but you actually have these times to decompress and just process information. So
and notice, and with that, notice what's good every single day, even if things are looking pretty bleak and dark, which in law enforcement career you're gonna have many, many days like that. Find one thing that was good, even if it was the first cup of coffee you drank in the morning, tasted fabulous, then maybe that's it, but it's one thing. It's one thing.
Yeah. Gratitude journaling. That's we could probably have a whole nother show on that. Just one thing right there. But all right. Well, let's wrap it up. I really appreciate you spending your valuable time with us today. We've got some really cool takeaways here. Before we close it out, if somebody wants to get in touch with you to learn more, how might they reach out to you?
I check out my email, which is Suzanne. I'll spell it for you too. Is that okay? I'm just going to spell it out. It's Suzanna Hasnay, SUZANNA HASNAY, one word, at PoliceSpirit.com. And that's the name of my company, PoliceSpirit.
So do you have a website, PoliceSpirit?
I do. It's PoliceSpirit.com. Yeah, it's
Okay.
all one word. If you type in PoliceSpirit separately, it'll be the police song, "We Are Spirits in the Material World," whatever that is, you'll see like Sting, right?
Yeah.
So
Nice.
if you put Police Spirit together, it'll be my company. You separate it, you'll see Sting, which is not a bad thing, but I'm just saying that's what will come out.
I would sing that for you, but I don't think we want to close out a podcast episode with me singing. It's never pretty.
That might cause some trauma, right? So
yeah. I already had a friend told me I ruined Bon Jovi for him. So I don't want to ruin the police for anyone else.
There you go. There you go.
Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for being here today. Thank you, Suzanna. And until the next time, I'm 1042.